So we know that each gospel's account of the resurrection is somewhat different in detail. That doesn't mean these accounts are contradictory. What it does mean is they're human. They are stories told about a miraculous event told from different human being viewpoints. So we would expect there to be some differences. So today, to honor that, I'm not going to try to homogenize the stories into one account of the resurrection, but I'm going to focus on the events as they were told by John in the Gospel of John. And as we start, I invite you to try, put yourself there in that moment, on that day. I invite you to close your eyes and try to imagine what it would have been like to be there. Sun's not quite up yet. Sun is still hiding behind the hills, but the sky is clear and there's that kind of pearly glow that it gets before the sun actually comes up. Birds are chirping to announce the dying of the night. As you walk through the streets of Jerusalem toward the gate, there's a chill in the air. It's not enough to take your breath away, but it's enough to make you draw your cloak a little tighter. And the windows around you are dark because there's almost nobody in this city that's swollen to like 100,000 people for the holiday. There's very few people at least that are up. So you pass through the gate and you go down the road a little bit and then off on a path to the side. And as you walk, the earth beneath your feet is still cool from the night. And maybe that coolness is what's contributing to the goosebumps that are starting to form on your arms. Or maybe it's the fact that you dread what you're going to see at the end of the path. Because that's where they laid Jesus. But even though you dread going to the end of that path, your steps quicken and you hurry a little bit because you just want to get this over with now. You want to do this one last act of service for your teacher. And your path turns and it curves and it goes down a slope a little bit so that the walls of the city behind you are almost invisible. But when you turn and you look to the side, there is something else that is too visible. Because from where you're walking, you can see the place of the skull with its forest of upright poles that's waiting to welcome more people to death. And you see that, and then you actually do shiver because you're trying to blot out the sights and the sounds of that Friday before. And that so preoccupies you that you almost don't realize when you get to the place of the tomb. And you get there, and you stop. You stand totally still and you stare. Because now you're staring at an open grave. You're staring at the hole in the rock that leads to the tomb of your beloved teacher. And suddenly it's as though somebody has drained all of the blood from your body and they've replaced it with ice-cold water. The tomb. The tomb of your beloved Jesus is open, and it's open to the things that gnaw on the dead, and it's open to the insects that feast on flesh, and who knows what else. And that very sight horrifies you so much that you have to race back to where you knew some of the disciples, at least, were hiding. And you go back and you get them because you want them to see this horror for themselves. Either maybe because they need to know or because you just want this burden shared with somebody. Looking back with the knowledge that we have, sometimes we tend to color this moment and we think, surely they must have had some inkling now. They must have had some idea. what was happening? But no. They had no clue. Because in Mary's place, in the place of the other disciples, what they knew for a dead certainty was that Jesus was dead. They had seen him die on a cross. You had gone to bed Friday night knowing that, and you had mourned all day Saturday and tried to make some sense of it all. And now this last horror just wrenches at your heart. When the others come back to the tomb with you, when they race ahead of you to the tomb, all of your worst suspicions are realized, because they get there and they realize that Jesus is not just dead now, but he is dead. His body has been stolen. John's Gospel tells us that the unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved saw and believed. He didn't believe that Jesus had risen. He believed that Jesus' body had been stolen, just as Mary had said. "2,000 years later now, to us, grave robbing is almost an unthinkable crime. But to first century Jews, it was unimaginable. Because by their law of bodies, even the bodies of criminals, the bodies of enemies, by their law, the bodies were supposed to be treated with respect and dignity. They were supposed to be given a proper burial. They were not supposed to be stolen. Maybe even desecrated in some way. So if the mood on Friday and Saturday that weekend had been grief and loss, then on Sunday it turned to abject horror and shock. And with the sick realization of what had happened, the men, the disciples that she had brought there, retreated back to wherever they had been hiding to try to collect themselves. But Mary, who was overcome with grief, stays there. She can't bring herself to leave this last place that she had seen Jesus, this last connection that she had. So she stayed. And she wept. And it's in that moment of utter defeat and despair, that moment of total darkness, we first get that glimpse of Easter's power. We first get that glimpse of the meaning of Easter, because in that moment, Mary goes over and she peers into the tomb, what she knew was an empty tomb. And inside she saw two angels. She saw two angels where her teacher, her friend, had been. And she has this very, very short conversation. And then while she's trying to wrap her head around that very short conversation, the voice behind her gets her attention. And she turns, and there's just another short conversation, and all of a sudden Jesus identifies himself simply by saying her name. Mary. Mary. And those familiar tones, that familiar voice, that name that she had heard him say, opened her eyes. And it's hard to imagine now the swirl of emotions that must have overtaken her at that moment. There was joy and confusion and wonder and relief. Maybe even some fear, because, after all, Jesus was dead. And now, here he was. With all of these feelings reeling through her mind, with all her heart suddenly as light as it had been heavy a moment before, and with all of the joy that had suddenly replaced the grief, Mary reached out to clutch at her risen teacher. She reached out to wrap her arms around him in grim determination that she would not let him go again. She was like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. And it's at that moment that Jesus says this very puzzling thing. Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Ever since I was a kid, which is a very long time ago, I've tripped over that. In that moment of utter joy and everything, he says, don't touch me. What does that mean? The Greek word that's translated as hold on to, the Greek word is hapto. And like so many other great words, it can mean a number of different things. It can mean to touch or to meddle or to hinder, in addition to hold on to. It can mean a few other things that just clearly don't apply here, but those meanings alone seem to say that Jesus' first instruction, after he establishes who he is, with this first person to see him risen, it seems that Jesus' first instruction is to say, don't bother me. I want you to do something else. I want you to do this thing. And this thing, of course, is to report back to the other disciples about what had happened. When I was a kid, going to Bethany Lutheran Church, Reverend Brentley taught us that the don't touch me thing had to do with the fact that Jesus, having risen, had a glorified body. Whatever that really meant. And that touching him would have actually been dangerous to her. Even as a kid, that seemed a little bit rocky to me. As I've gotten older and older, now it seems, a little bit too Indiana Jones for me. She's going to touch him and his face melts or something. And then, of course, years later, when I hear this or read this, I think of MC Hammer. You can't touch this. So it's still a little bit confusing. And then I read there's a theory that actually makes sense in the context of John's Gospel. John, of course, was very focused on the idea that Jesus died as this kind of super Passover offering. It's one of the reasons that his account of the crucifixion and the resurrection and all of that are different from the other Gospels, because his focus is that Jesus, fulfilling the laws that as the Jewish people knew them, had died as a sacrifice of atonement for them. So thinking of it from that standpoint, and it's interesting to know, once a sacrifice is made in the temple, whatever is being sacrificed, a portion of it is burned. And as it burns, the smoke from the fire ascends into heaven, and it reaches God, and according to what they believe, that scent pleases God. During this process, the sacrifice can only be touched by a priest, possibly the high priest. And if, by chance, somewhere in that process, the sacrifice were to be touched by somebody who was ritually impure, say, for instance, somebody who had been in contact with a dead body, then that touch would render the sacrifice impure. And And so in that context, and by that reasoning, Jesus was really saying to Mary, don't touch me, because if you do, then everything I've done might be wiped away by that contact. Now, I've simplified that a lot, mostly because I don't understand it all. But that's the short explanation. And because it's so culturally different from us, it's hard for me to really understand that and for me to really say, yeah, that must be it. But it's interesting, and it does fit the framework that the author of the Gospel of John had. But looking back at it through modern eyes now, 2,000 and some years later, there is something else about it, and I think it's a more powerful and relevant message that we can get from this, because Jesus also seems to be saying, don't try to hold me back. He's risen. In defiance of everything everybody knew could possibly be, Jesus Christ has risen, and now he's saying, don't hold me back. Don't try to hold on to me. You've seen what I can do. You have seen the power and the glory of God as you've seen him rise from the tomb. So don't try to hold me back now while there's work to be done. And then he dispatches her to start the work of Easter. So with that way of looking at it, what does that tell us? It tells us that the good news of Easter is not meant to be held closely to our hearts. It may be a source of joy for us, it may be a source of happiness, but we are not intended to hold it close to us. It is meant to be shouted from the rooftops. It's meant to burst forth like a river of grace, overflowing its banks and washing over all of humanity. That's the intent of the work of Easter. After that horrific Friday, Mary never expected to find Jesus where she did, outside the tomb and alive. And I'll take that as a reminder that we never really know where we're going to encounter Jesus either. We never know how we're going to see him. But we do know Easter does tell us that he will be there. And that we will encounter him. We never know when or how we're going to feel Jesus at work in our lives, mending our hearts and soothing our worries, or making a way for us through the darkness, but we know that he will be there. The resurrection promises that. The resurrection and the Easter story promise us that there is no darkness so deep and no sorrow so heavy that he cannot lift it from us. And the Easter story, the resurrection, teach us that there is no sin that we can commit and no gulf that we can create between us and God so deep that it can't be bridged by the cross. That is the promise of Easter morning. Not even death can hold Jesus back. Not even death can keep Jesus from finding us. Not even death can keep Jesus from calling to each of us by name. Not even death can keep us from being reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. Not even death can extinguish. Jesus Christ is risen. Hallelujah.